At 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, my mother sent me a text that wasn't meant for me. It said, "Kate fell asleep in the car. Oliver keeps asking about you. Wednesday still works." I didn't know anyone named Kate or Oliver. I sent back a single question mark. 60 seconds later, my phone rang. She never called after 10 p.m. I let it ring twice before I answered. "That wasn't meant for you, sweetheart." Already composed. Already decided. "Who's Kate?" I asked. Silence. "And Oliver." "We'll talk tomorrow," she said. "I need you to trust me right now." Which is almost exactly what she said to me 17 years ago when I was 14, and she explained that my father had decided to leave our family. "Trust me, it'll make sense eventually." I hung up. And then I started looking. Her name is Diane Calloway. She's 61. The kind of woman who irons linen on Sundays, as it costs her something spiritually to skip it. Perfect posture. Every conversation was managed with this calm, pleasant expression that communicated one thing clearly: this is not a discussion I intend to lose. I'm Claire, 31, one-bedroom apartment in Oak Park, Illinois, 22 minutes from the house I grew up in. Until 6 months ago, I thought I had a clear picture of my family. 2 parents who couldn't make a marriage work, one who stayed, one who left. My mother's version, which she had spent 17 years making sound airtight. What she told me when I was 14, my father simply decided he didn't want to be a husband or father anymore. No big fight. He was struggling. He was lost, and rather than damage us further, he left. She delivered this at the kitchen table with chamomile tea, which she never drank. Calm, sad, final, I cried. She didn't. I remember thinking that was strange. But I was 14, and when your mother hands you the story of your own family, you take it, because the alternative, that the story might not be true, is too much to hold. So I held it instead. For 17 years. Here's what took me 31 years to name about my mother. She never lied to you directly. She redirected. When I was 16, I asked why she never talked about college. She was drying a plate, didn't pause. Those were quiet years, sweetheart. Back then, I heard quiet and moved on. Sitting in my car at midnight after that text message, I finally heard what quiet actually meant. Hidden, but the text wasn't where this started. It started 6 weeks earlier, in her kitchen on a Wednesday night I almost forgot about. I was chopping carrots at her counter. She was at the table sorting mail. Her phone buzzed. She flipped it face down in one motion and pressed her palm flat on top of it. "Who was that?" "Work," she said, before I finished the question. At 8:30, the polished smile. "Just confirming something for tomorrow, dear." She picked up an envelope, sliced it open. She read it once and set it aside, as nothing had happened. I kept cutting, but I didn't let it go. Because I'd spent 31 years watching her redirect instead of answer, and I knew the difference between a boring work email and something she needed to bury. I just convinced myself I was being paranoid. 3 weeks later, I ran into a girl from high school at a coffee shop near my office. Rachel Deng, casual catch-up, the usual. Then she mentioned my mother. "I saw her a few months ago, at that Italian place on Washington Street." I nodded. She was with a man, late 50s, gray at the temples. Honestly, he looked really comfortable with her, like they'd been going there forever. Washington Street is in Berwyn. My mother did not eat at neighborhood Italian spots in Berwyn. She had curated places with wine lists printed in italics. She had opinions about restaurant acoustics. She wasn't there as herself, or at least not the version of herself I knew. "What did he look like again?" I asked. Dark hair going gray, worn down but comfortable, like he knew her. I smiled and said it was probably someone from her office. That night, I drove past her house on the way home. It was 8 o'clock on a Friday. Her car wasn't in the driveway. I sat at the end of her street for 2 minutes, then drove away. But I stopped dismissing things after that. 3 weeks later, I followed her. I stayed 3 cars back the whole drive, down Ogden Avenue, through Forest Park, and into a neighborhood I'd never been to. She turned onto a quiet street and pulled up in front of a small ranch house with faded blue shutters and a plastic tricycle on the porch. I watched her get out of the car and walk up the front steps, and before she could knock, the door opened. A man stood in the frame, late 50s, dark hair going gray, and behind him, half hidden behind his leg, were two small children. My mother went straight to them. She bent down and pulled them both into her arms like she'd done it 100 times before, because she had. I sat there with both hands on the steering wheel, engine running, watching my mother hold two children I'd never heard of, in a life I didn't know existed, 20 minutes from the house where she raised me. I didn't get out of the car. I drove home and sat in my apartment until 4 in the morning, turning over a single question that kept sharpening the longer I held it. How long? Before I tell you what happened 3 days later, the phone call that rewrote everything I thought I knew about my family. Subscribe to Sorrow Nest Tales and tell me in the comments, what would you have done if you were sitting in that car? And then, 3 days later, my father called me out of nowhere. He never called, and when I answered, the first thing he said was, "Your mother told me you found out." Which meant he already knew, which meant he'd known for a long time. And the answer he gave me next didn't just explain the secret. It completely rewrote the story of why my father left. My father's name is Daniel Reeves. For most of my life, he existed as a kind of outline. Birthday cards with short, neutral notes, occasional emails, a mailed gift card at Christmas with 3 lines of text that always sounded like he was trying not to take up too much space. That was it. So when I saw his name on my phone screen at 9 p.m. on a Thursday, I already knew something was wrong. I answered on the second ring. "Your mother told me you found out," he said, "about the other family." His voice was thin, careful. "You knew?" I asked. "No," a pause then, "not until she called me yesterday." I leaned against my kitchen counter and waited. "She said you followed her," he continued. "To the house." I did. Another silence, longer this time, and then I asked the question I should have asked at 14, at 16, at 22. At every point in my life when I accepted the version of events I was handed and moved on. "Dad, why did you really leave?" I heard him exhale slowly. "Because your mother asked me to." I didn't say anything. "She said it would be better for you if I weren't around, that she could give you a more stable life without me complicating things." "That's not what she told me," I said quietly. "I know." The way he said it, flat, already resigned, like he'd been carrying this a long time, hit harder than if he'd been defensive. "She needed me to be the reason," he said. "It was cleaner." "The reason for what?" And then he said it. "Claire, I didn't leave your mother. She needed me gone. Because by the time we divorced, she'd already been with Martin for 3 years." I set my phone on the counter, not on purpose. My hand just opened. I picked it back up. 3 years, I repeated. "At least," he said. "Probably longer." 3 years before the divorce. 3 years before, she sat me at that kitchen table with untouched chamomile tea and told me my father had chosen to leave. She already had another family in progress, and she needed a villain to make the exit clean. She picked him. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I called in sick, which I hadn't done in 2 years, and sat at my kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee, doing the math. Kate is 7. Oliver is 5. If Martin and my mother had been together at least 3 years before a divorce that happened when I was 14, and I'm 31 now, that's a relationship spanning at minimum 14 years. Possibly longer. 14 years. Kate and Oliver weren't a second chapter. They were running parallel to my entire adult life. Every Sunday dinner, every holiday, every phone call where she asked about my job, my apartment, whether I was eating properly. She was also this. Also on Wednesday nights. Also that house with the blue shutters and the tricycle on the porch. Both. The whole time. I kept trying to find the moment she would tell me eventually. The plan was for when I'd find out on her terms. I couldn't find it, because I don't think that plan existed. I went back to Berwyn 4 days later, not to see my mother. She didn't know I was coming. I knocked on the door of the ranch house at 2 p.m. on a Saturday. Martin answered. Up close, he looked exactly like Rachel described, worn down in a specific, load-bearing way. Like someone who'd spent years holding up something he already knew was unstable. He looked at me for a second, then said, "Claire, not a question. You know who I am," I said. "Diane told me about you." He stepped back from the doorway. Last year. Last year, not when I was born, not when he and my mother got serious, not when Kate was born or Oliver. Last year, I stepped inside. The house was small and lived in a way my mother's house never was. Shoes by the door. A kid's drawing was stuck to the fridge with a magnet shaped like a pineapple. A half-built Lego set on the coffee table. Martin poured 2 cups of coffee without asking and set one in front of me. We sat across from each other at a kitchen table that had dried paint on one corner and a ring stain nobody had gotten around to fixing. "Did you know," I asked, "about me before last year?" He looked at his cup. "I knew Diane had a daughter," he said carefully. "She told me early on. She said the relationship was complicated, that you were close, but that you had a lot of your father in you, and she wasn't sure how you'd take the situation." I stared at him. "She said that?" "Yes, that I have a lot of my father in me." He nodded slowly, like he already knew how it sounded. My mother had been pre-framing me as the unstable variable. The reason the secret had to stay a secret. Not her choices, me. I wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "Did you ever want to reach out?" I asked. "Before last year?" "Yes," he said, "but..." He looked up. "Diane said it would destabilize things, that you weren't ready. She said that for 14 years. "I know." He said it the same way my father had said, "I know," on the phone 4 nights earlier. Quiet, tired, resigned. Like a man who'd spent a long time choosing not to push on something because pushing felt more dangerous. The kids weren't home. "They were at a birthday party," Martin said. "He offered to have me meet them another time, properly, if I wanted. I said I'd think about it." I drove home with both hands on the wheel and the radio off, and I kept coming back to one thing Martin said at the door when I was leaving. I'd asked him when he first realized my mother wasn't going to tell me on her own. He thought about it for a second. Then he said, "About 2 years ago, she got a second phone." A second phone. I pulled over on Ogden Avenue and sat there for a minute. Then I thought about something specific, something small that I had completely dismissed at the time. Last Christmas, my mother had set her bag down on my kitchen counter, and 2 phones had slid out. She picked them both up quickly, said one was for work. I didn't think anything of it. I believed her, because believing her was what I'd been trained to do. I called her that evening. She answered on the first ring. "I need to see you," I said. "Tomorrow, not your house. Mine." The pause. "Of course," she said, controlled, careful, already preparing. She showed up at noon the next day in a gray blazer and pressed trousers. Carrying a container of homemade soup like this was a wellness visit. I did not take the soup. I sat down across from her at my kitchen table, the same way she'd sat across from me at her 17 years ago, and I put my phone between us with the screen facing up. On it was a screenshot. Her contact in Martin's phone, which he had shown me without realizing what he was showing me when he scrolled to find the date she'd first visited. Her contact name wasn't Diane. It wasn't Mom. It wasn't anything I expected. My mother looked at the screen, and for the first time in 31 years, I watched her decide not to perform her way out of something. She closed her eyes, and then she said 5 words that made everything worse. Her contact name in Martin's phone was D. Reeves, not Calloway, not Diane, not anything that matched the life I knew. Reeves, my father's last name. She'd been using it with Martin's family long enough that it sat in his phone without explanation, without context, as it had always been there. How long have you been using that name with them? She folded her hands in her lap. It felt simpler. Martin's family knew I'd been married. I didn't want to explain the change. Did Martin know your real name? Yes, eventually. That word again, eventually. What do Kate and Oliver call you? Diane, not Grandma. No, Martin was married before, briefly. Their mother isn't involved, so I've been present in that way. I walked to the window, just needed a second with my back to her. Outside, a neighbor was raking leaves into a pile his dog kept scattering. Completely ordinary Saturday. I turned back around. Tell me when it actually started. She looked at me steadily. I met Martin when I was 17. I'd been living in that house, eating dinner at that table, asking her about her day. You were still married to Dad. Yes. So you asked him to leave 2 years later when I understood I wasn't going to end things with Martin. Not a crisis, not a mistake she couldn't undo, a decision she made clear-eyed, and then built a structure around. Did Dad know why when you asked him to leave? She looked down at the table. I told him we'd grown apart, so he didn't know what he was actually being moved out for. She reached for her coffee cup, but her hand wasn't quite steady. She noticed it herself. She set the cup back down and folded both hands in her lap. First time in 31 years I'd ever seen her hand shake. He spent 17 years thinking he failed this family, I said, while you were driving to Berwyn. She didn't answer that. Not because she was calculating. I could see the difference now. She just didn't have anything to say to it. She stayed for 2 hours. I'll give her that. She didn't leave when it got hard. She sat in her gray blazer across from me and confirmed every specific thing I put in front of her, the timeline, Martin's phone, and the second phone at Christmas, without making me fight for any of it. But somewhere in the second hour, the composure started slipping. Not all at once, more like watching something structural give way slowly. Her answers got shorter, longer pauses before each one. At one point, I asked her something, I don't even remember what, and she just sat there for a moment with her eyes closed. Not performing, just tired. Genuinely tired in a way I hadn't seen before. When she opened them, she said, I know this doesn't help you, but I never stopped loving you through any of it. I know you didn't, I said. She looked surprised. That's actually the part that makes it harder. She pressed her lips together, looked away, and for the first time, her eyes went wet. She didn't cry, but they stayed wet for the rest of the conversation, and she didn't try to hide it, which, from Diane Calloway, was its own kind of breaking. Near the end, she told me something she didn't have to. Kate had started asking Martin questions recently. Why doesn't Diane have her own kids? Does she have a family? Martin had told her she has a daughter. She lives nearby, and Kate had asked, why doesn't she ever come? My mother told me this herself, unprompted. At the end, she looked at me and said, I think she's been asking him for a few weeks now, he told me. I understood what she was actually saying, not that Kate was curious, that something had shifted, that the shape of the secret had started changing on its own, the way they always do. Is that why the text happened? I asked. You were distracted. She considered it. Maybe, she said. I don't know. She picked up her bag slowly and put on her coat. At the door, she stopped. I'm not going to ask you to forgive me, she said. I just want you to know that I understand if you can't. Then she left. I sat on my couch and didn't move for a while, not piecing things together, just sitting with the weight of a specific thing she'd said earlier that I kept coming back to. Martin had been married before. Briefly. Their mother isn't involved. 5 years passed between when my mother met Martin and when Kate was born. I didn't know what happened in those years, or who else was part of the story. So a week later, I asked him. I drove back to Berwyn on a Tuesday afternoon and knocked on the door. Martin answered in a paint-stained sweatshirt, clearly not expecting anyone. We sat at his kitchen table again. Same ring stain on the corner. Same Lego set on the coffee table. Further along now, I asked him about the years before Kate and Oliver, about his first marriage. He looked at his coffee for a moment. It ended before the kids, he said carefully. We weren't right for each other. Did my mother know her? He stayed quiet long enough that I had my answer before he gave it. Your mother and I were already involved when my first marriage ended, he said. So yes, Diane knew her. How well? He looked at me steadily. They weren't strangers, he said. I'll tell you that much. But the rest of it, Claire, some of that history isn't mine to give you. It belongs to your mother. I drove home and called her. She picked up on the second ring. I said, tell me about Martin's first wife. A pause, long enough that I could hear her breathing. Her name was Susan, she said finally, and I knew that name, not from recent memory, from childhood, from years ago. I knew that name because I had known that woman, Susan Ellery. That was her full name. I knew her because she used to come to our house. Not constantly, not weekly, but enough. She and my mother had met through some women's professional group in the early 2000s at least. That's what I was always told. She'd come for dinner occasionally. She brought wine. She laughed easily. She had short dark hair and drove a green Subaru that I remembered because I thought it was cool when I was a kid. She stopped coming around when I was about 17. My mother told me they'd drifted apart. That Susan had moved. That people grew in different directions. I accepted that completely because I was 17 and because I had no reason not to. I sat in my car outside my apartment for 20 minutes after my mother said her name. Then I drove to Hinsdale. She was in the garden when I pulled up, pruning something along the side fence, wearing gloves, and not expecting me. She saw my face and took the gloves off. We went inside. She put the kettle on, that automatic thing she did when situations required managing, and I sat at her kitchen table and waited. How long, I said, did you know Martin before Susan introduced you? She set 2 cups down carefully. I didn't meet him through Susan. Then how? She sat across from me. I met him first, she said. Martin and I met at a conference in 2001, before he knew Susan, before any of it. She kept her voice level, but her hands were wrapped around her cup too tightly. We were involved briefly. Then it ended, or I thought it ended. A year later, he met Susan through mutual friends, and Susan mentioned him to me, not knowing you'd already been with him. Yes. The kettle started to boil. Neither of us moved. Did he tell Susan? No, did you? She looked at me directly. No. I sat with that for a moment. My mother had watched her friend fall for a man she'd already been involved with, and said nothing. Had watched Susan marry him, had come to our house for dinners during those years, cheerful, easy, bringing wine while sitting on that. When did it start again? You and Martin. When Susan was pregnant with their first child. The air in the room changed. Their first child, I repeated. Yes. So Martin's first marriage didn't just end because they weren't right for each other. She didn't answer. He was with you while Susan was pregnant. It wasn't. She stopped herself. Started again. It wasn't immediate. It was built again slowly. I didn't plan it. Did Susan find out? A long pause. Yes, she said quietly. That's why the marriage ended. I leaned back in my chair. That was the full shape of it now. My mother hadn't just built a secret life alongside mine. She'd walked into her friend's marriage, restarted something she knew she should have buried, and let Susan's life come apart around it. Then once Martin was free, she kept it all hidden from me for 14 years. From my father for the entire duration, and from Martin's own children for the whole of their lives. And Susan just disappeared, drifted away. People grow in different directions. Does she know it was you? I asked. Susan, does she know you're the reason her marriage ended? My mother's jaw tightened. She knows we became involved again, yes. Did she know while it was happening? She found out toward the end. So she knew her husband was leaving her for a woman who used to come to her dinner parties. My mother set her cup down. Claire, and then you just stopped seeing her, said you drifted apart. What was I supposed to do? She said it without thinking, and she heard herself the moment it came out. The silence that followed was the most honest thing that had happened between us in years. Her eyes filled. Not the restrained wet she'd managed at my apartment. Actually filled. I have carried Susan with me every day, she said. Her voice cracked on the last word, not dramatically, just cleanly, like a plate splitting along a fault line. I know what I did to her. I have always known. And you kept coming to our house anyway. Yes. With wine. Yes. She pressed 2 fingers to her mouth for a moment, then lowered them. I didn't know how to undo it, so I kept going. And then Martin and it became what it became. And by that point, there was too much to undo. So you just kept building on top of it. She looked at me with wet eyes and no answer. That's the thing I finally understood sitting at that table. The lie wasn't a single decision. It was architecture. Built piece by piece over 14 years, every new layer was added because tearing it down meant exposing everything underneath. My father's exit, Susan's marriage, my entire understanding of my own childhood, it was all load-bearing, and she had known that for a long time. I want to ask you something, I said, and I need you to answer it straight. She nodded. Did you love him, Martin? Was it real, or was it just easier to keep than to end? She didn't answer immediately. For the first time in this whole conversation, she seemed to be genuinely deciding whether to say the true thing. Both, she said finally. For a long time, both. At least that was honest. I stood up, put my coat on. I'm not coming to Sunday dinners anymore, I said. Not for a while, maybe not for a long time. She nodded. She didn't argue or negotiate. She just sat there at her own kitchen table, looking smaller than I'd ever seen her, both hands around a cup of tea gone cold. I got to the front door and stopped. One more thing I needed to say, not to hurt her, just because it was true, and she needed to hear it from me directly. Kate and Oliver are going to figure this out eventually, I said. Kids always do, and when they ask you who I am, I don't want you to redirect. I don't want it to be quiet. I want you to tell them the truth. She looked at me from the table. I will, she said. I don't know if I believed her, but I left. 3 weeks later, Martin called me. He wasn't calling to explain anything. He was calling because Kate had found something. He called because Kate had found something. A photograph. In a box in the hall closet that she'd pulled down, looking for craft supplies. It was a picture of my mother and me. I'm maybe 9 years old. We're at some lakeside park, squinting into the sun. My mother's arm is around me. Kate had brought it to Martin and asked, "Is that Diane when she was little?" And Martin had said, "No, sweetheart, that's Diane with her daughter." And Kate had looked at the photograph for a moment and said the following, "She looks like me." Martin told me this in a steady voice. Then he said, "I think it's time, Claire. I think we need to tell them something real. I can't keep answering her questions with half answers." I agreed, which meant one thing had to happen first. The 3 of us, me, my mother, and Martin, needed to be in the same room for the first time, together. My mother, when I called her that evening, said yes without hesitating. No performance, no managing, just tell me when. Some secrets collapse all at once. Others come apart slowly, piece by piece, until there's nowhere left to hide. If you've ever watched that happen, subscribe to Sorrow Nest Tales. And tell me in the comments when you think Diane realized the truth was finally catching up to her. For the first time, I believed she meant it. We met on a Saturday morning in November. Martin's kitchen, his idea, neutral enough, he said. I got there first, sat at the table with the ring stain on the corner and waited. Martin made coffee without asking, same as before, and we didn't say much. The kids were at a neighbor's house. Whatever happened first needed to happen without them in the room. My mother arrived at 10 on the dot. Gray coat, dark sweater underneath. She looked like herself, but quieter, like something had been turned down in her that couldn't go back up. She sat across from me. Martin sat at the end between us. Nobody spoke for a moment, then my mother said, "I've been trying to figure out how to start this for 3 weeks." "There's no good place," I said. "Just start." She nodded. "I made choices that cost people things they deserve to keep," she said. "Your father, Susan." She paused. "You." "Dad," I said. "Tell me about Dad specifically." She looked at me. "I told him he'd be better for you at a distance, that you needed stability and he couldn't give you that. You told me he chose to go." "Yes." "For 17 years." "Yes." I leaned forward slightly. "Then why did you let me hate him for you?" She opened her mouth, closed it. It was the first time in the entire conversation, maybe in my entire life, that I watched my mother have no answer ready, not a redirect, not a managed pause, just nothing. Her eyes went wet, and she looked down at the table long enough that Martin shifted in his chair. When she finally looked up, she said the following: "Because it was easier than watching you look at me the way you're looking at me right now." The room stayed quiet after that. Martin looked down at the table. "I knew more than I let myself admit," he said, "about what she was carrying about you." He glanced at me. I told myself it wasn't my place, but that was easier too. No performance, just two people sitting with what they'd actually done. "I don't need more explanation," I said finally. "I understand how it happened. What I can't get past is Susan. I can logic my way around most of this, not that." My mother held my eyes. "I know. She was in our house. I know. And you still, yes." We sat with that until it settled. I said what I'd come to say. "I'll be part of Kate's and Oliver's lives if they want that. That's not conditional on anything. They didn't do anything wrong." Martin nodded. "But I need you to hear this," I said to my mother. "I'm not coming back to Sunday dinners to make it comfortable again. If we have any relationship at all, it has to be different. I can't go back to not asking questions." "I don't want you to," she said. "I mean it." "I know you do." I looked at her for a moment. "Do you understand what the actual damage was?" I said. "Not the lying. The years. 17 years of building my understanding of my own family on a story you wrote. I didn't just lose the truth. I lost the version of my father I could have had while I still had time to have it." She didn't look away. Her jaw moved slightly. "Yes," she said quietly. "I know what I took." There was nothing to add to that. The kids came back around noon. Martin had kept it simple. Diane has a daughter named Claire. She's been part of Diane's life for a long time. Today you're going to meet her. Kate walked in first, still in her coat, and looked at me the way children do when they've already decided to be curious. "You're Claire," she said. "I am." She studied me for a moment. I then looked at my mother, then back at me. "How come you never came before?" she asked. Not mean, just direct. The way 7-year-olds are. She genuinely wanted to know. I didn't answer. My mother, standing at the counter behind me, made a small sound, not a word, just the sound a person makes when something hits them somewhere they've kept protected. "We're figuring that out," Martin said quietly. Kate seemed to accept that. She slid off the chair and went to find her brother. I didn't look at my mother for a moment. When I did, she had turned back toward the window. 14 years, kept in separate boxes in separate houses, 22 minutes apart, and a 7-year-old had named the whole thing in 9 words. I left around 2. My mother walked me to my car. We stood in the driveway in the cold. Dead leaves moved across the concrete between us. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I came for them," I said. "Not for you. I want to be honest about that." She took that without flinching. "I know." I opened the car door. "Claire." I looked at her. She didn't have anything prepared. She stood there in her dark sweater in the November cold, and for a moment she looked less like the woman who had managed every room she'd ever walked into, and more like someone standing at the edge of something they'd already broken and couldn't fix. "I'm sorry," she said. "Not for what it cost me, for what it costs you." I nodded, got in the car, drove home. That was 4 months ago. I see Kate and Oliver on some Saturdays. We're still figuring out what to call what I am to them. There isn't a clean word for it. My father and I talk most weeks. We're rebuilding something that was damaged before I was old enough to know it was being damaged. It's slow, sometimes awkward. Neither of us knows how far it goes. My mother and I have had coffee 3 times, not Sunday dinners, not her house, a cafe near my apartment, an hour at a time. She doesn't redirect anymore. When I ask hard questions, she answers them, sometimes incompletely. But she answers. It's the most honest she's ever been with me. I don't know what we're building. I'm not sure it has a name. If you've ever had to rebuild your understanding of someone you thought you knew completely, subscribe to Sorrow Nest Tales. And tell me in the comments whether trust like this ever fully comes back, or if some distance always remains. Last week, I was leaving the cafe after one of those hours with her and stopped on the sidewalk to put on my gloves. She was still inside, settling the bill. Through the window, I watched her say something to the cashier that made the young woman laugh. That easy, natural warmth she'd always had. The room responded to her easily, without knowing anything about her at all. She's still that person. I stood there on the sidewalk in the cold, watching my mother through a window, and understood that this is probably what it's going to feel like for a long time. Close enough to see her clearly. Outside the glass,